Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times, a Prancing Pony podcast production. I'm the Man of the West, and after spending a year's worth of Third Age Thursdays diving deep into the poetry and songs from the Lord of the Rings, I've really enjoyed this series with our look at Middle-earth artifacts of the Third Age. We looked at Glamdring, Orcrist, Sting, and the Arkenstone, all from The Hobbit, before moving into the Lord of the Rings, where we began with the heirlooms of Elendil, the shards of Narsil, its reforging as Anduril, and the famed Ring of Barahir, as well as the Scepter of Annúminas last week. Now this week, we're going to look at another artifact that made its way down through the line of the Lords of Andúnier, the Elendilmir. Also known as the Star of Elendil, this has an incredible history, and we actually read about it in The Lord of the Rings before we know what it is necessarily. Back when Tom Bombadil gave the Blades of Westernesse to the hobbits after their escape from the Barrow, he spoke about the men who were overcome by the evil king of Carn-dûm in the land of Angmar. "Few now remember them," Tom murmured. "Yet still some go wandering, sons of forgotten kings, walking in loneliness, guarding from evil things folk that are heedless." The hobbits did not understand his words, nor do most of us, frankly. But as he spoke, they had a vision, as it were, of a great expanse of years behind them, like a vast shadowy plain, over which there strode shapes of men, tall and grim with bright swords, and last came one with a star on his brow. A star on his brow? That star is, of course, the Elendilmir. And if we go to The Disaster of the Gladden Fields in Unfinished Tales, which I'll be covering in Season 10 on the PPP, I think around April, we discover that the first Elendilmir, that's right, there are two, and I will get to that, the first Elendilmir originally belonged to Silmarien, the daughter and eldest child of Tar Elendil, the fourth king of Númenor. In those days, as we talked about last week, the Númenorian throne went to the eldest son rather than the eldest child, and so the scepter went to her brother. Recapping, Silmarien went on to marry a man from Andúnier and have a son by the name of Valandil. He was the first of the Lords of Andúnier, a title granted to him by Tar Elendil. Now the Lords of Andúnier were of the faithful, always of the faithful, and it was from that line that Elendil, and therefore Isildur and eventually Aragorn, were descended. So, just like the Scepter of Annúminas and the Ring of Barahir, the Elendilmir was handed down through Silmarien's line of descent. In fact, it made it all the way to Isildur, who was wearing it during the disaster of the Gladden Fields. And there we read, "Isildur turned west, and, drawing up the ring that hung in a wallet from a fine chain about his neck, he set it upon his finger with a cry of pain, and was never seen again by any eye upon Middle-earth. But the Elendilmir of the west could not be quenched, and suddenly it blazed forth red and wrathful as a burning star. Men and orcs gave way in fear, and Isildur, drawing a hood over his head, vanished into the night." Now, as a side note, that's also evidence that Sean and I have talked about before to argue that anything that gives off its own light would then not itself be invisible when its bearer was wearing the one ring. Think the Vial of Galadriel, for example. But back to the Elendilmir. What's important for the history of it is what happened to Isildur after he lost the ring in the water and came out on the other side of the Anduin. There he rose up out of the water, only a mortal man, a small creature lost and abandoned in the wilds of Middle-earth. But to the night-eyed orcs that lurked there on the watch, he loomed up, a monstrous shadow of fear, with a piercing eye like a star. They loosed their poisoned arrows at it, and fled. Needlessly, for Isildur, unarmed, was pierced through heart and throat, and without a cry he fell back into the water. No trace of his body was ever found by elves or men. Now, the elven smiths in Rivendell make a duplicate, a replacement for Isildur's youngest and only surviving son, also named Valandil. But Unfinished Tales says it had not the ancientry nor potency of the one that had been lost when Isildur fled into the dark and came back no more. Still, certainly a thing of beauty nonetheless. It was still a fillet of mithril with a white star of elvish crystal. Sound familiar? Let's read about its appearance in The Lord of the Rings again, also unnamed, from The Steward and the King. So now there was a wide space before the walls of Minas Tirith, and it was hemmed in upon all sides by the knights and the soldiers of Gondor and of Rohan, and by the people of the city and of all parts of the land. A hush fell upon all, as out from the host stepped the Dunedain in silver and gray, and before them came walking slow the Lord Aragorn. He was clad in black mail girt with silver, and he wore a long mantle of pure white, clasped at the throat with a great jewel of green that shone from afar. And we'll get to that jewel next week. But his head was bare, save for a star upon his forehead, bound by a slender fillet of silver. That is, as you now know, the Elendilmir. Or the second one, that is. What happened to the first? Let's go back to the disaster of the Gladden Fields for more. Once he becomes king, Aragorn goes about with the reordering of his realm. One of the things he does is restore Orthanc. There, thanks to Gimli, they find a hidden compartment. Maybe it had been intended to receive the ring, but it was almost bare. In a casket on a high shelf, two things were laid. One was a small case of gold attached to a fine chain. It was empty and bore no letter or token, but beyond all doubt, it had once borne the ring about Isildur's neck. Well, that's certainly something, but it's not the Elendilmir. But then we read, next to it lay a treasure without price, long mourned as lost forever, the Elendilmir itself, the white star of elvish crystal upon a fillet of mithril that had descended from Silmarion to Elendil, and had been taken by him as the token of royalty in the North Kingdom. Every king and the chieftains that followed them in Arnor had borne the Elendilmir down even to Elessar himself. But, and this is where we get the story of that replacement version that the elven smiths made. As for the original, Elessar took it up with reverence, and when he returned to the north and took up again the full kingship of Arnor, Arwen bound it upon his brow, and men were silent in amaze to see its splendor. But Elessar did not again imperil it, and wore it only on high days in the North Kingdom. Otherwise, when in kingly raiment, he bore the Elendilmir which had descended to him. That's the replacement originally made for Valandil. And this also is a thing of reverence, he said, and above my worth. 40 heads have worn it before. Folks, thank you for joining me for this week's Third Age Thursday. Come back next week when we only have one Elessar, but two origin stories instead. And be sure to come back tomorrow as we continue the story of Tuor and his coming to Gondolin on First Age Friday. Check out patreon.com/TolkienTimes to learn how you can support the show, get an ad-free feed, join my content council, get a bonus weekly episode, and more. Podcast listeners, please subscribe to the show in your apps. For those on YouTube, subscribe to this channel, and please follow @PrancingPonyPod on all your social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.